I just ceased to be the dean, let me mention that, and I feel very good about that. Together with Professor Podhorecka, we ceased to be deans, but I think that our faculty will continue to operate very well. I was faced with a challenge today to tell you about cognitive functions and at the same time mental health in elderly people, and it is all related to very important and very complex processes. With regard to cognitive functions, I need to remind you some important figures that we do not necessarily remember on a daily basis. Santiago Ramon y Cajal, a Nobel Prize laureate, in 1963 he received the Nobel Prize. 1906 he received the Nobel Prize for discovering brain cells. Like an entomologist chasing colored butterflies, he was chasing brain cells that reminded him of butterflies, and hopefully they would one day explain the secrets of mental and intellectual lives. Today, we have very good methods of discovering brain functions. We know a lot about the nature of our brain, and we managed to connect mental illnesses with the brain, because you may remember that there was a time when schizophrenia was only treated as impairment of contact with the environment. The etiology of very important mental disorders were sought in the environment and relationships, and it turned out that they are brain disorders. So fortunately, we know more about that. Another person, an American biologist and zoologist, he studied entomology, evolution, and social biology, and in Consilience he published a paper where he said that future psychiatry will be a field of science integrating information from various fields of knowledge, and that we'll have to look to research in biology, genetics, but also humanistic science, humanities. When talking about the brain and its functions, we come back to the Hippocrates theory that we need to have a holistic approach to human beings, that it's not about treating a disease. We treat a human being who has a certain illness. One of neuropsychologists who also received the Nobel Prize, Roger Sperry, who was the first to describe some functional centers for speech, emotions, interaction between the parts of the brain. He demonstrated that certain connections like corpus callosum or neuronal connections between parts of the brain are important. This has been confirmed by other scientists, so we now see a brain as one large network. So the brain is organized in a networked way. We have connections between various parts of the brain, and with regard to cognitive functions, their impairments are often related to dysfunction or structural disorders in parts of the network that are responsible for a certain process. Neurologists were aware for a long time that brain damage in one location generates impairment of functions that were not related to that part of the brain. So we know that the part of the connections in the brain that we can see in DTI imaging, those are connections that are individually organized in specific people. So although we have frontal, temporal lobes, we have specific anatomic brain structures, individual organization differs between individuals, and there are no two identical brains. So the challenge to today's neuropsychologists is to find out about the functional organization of an individual brain and then have an individual treatment plan. For seniors, for elderly people, we often talk about memory disorders or memory impairment because these are the conditions that our patients report to us. But memory has many names, and these functions are related to various parts, various centers of the brain. Our patients often say that they have problems with most recent memory. They cannot remember the names of people who spend time with them. They get lost, and the more the cognitive functions are impaired, the more areas are covered with memory issues. Patients tend to remember things that they learned early in their lives. But we are talking about declarative memory, which is related to the temporal lobe and the hippocampus. We have something completely different, which is a procedural memory. We used to laugh with Professor Podhorecka that earlier rehabilitation in patients suffering from early brain damage was mostly about motor rehabilitation. There was not even a mention of cognitive rehabilitation or mental rehabilitation. It was for the payer. The most interesting was for the patient to leave the hospital, but not to be able to come back to it, to find the way back. Patients who do not know where they live, they don't remember people or the names of people they have contact with, they still can walk, they can still ride bicycles, or they can even drive a car. I used to have a patient with huge impairment of operational function, so working memory related to the frontal lobe. This operational memory tells us about what is important in our environment, and thanks to online processes, it allows us to include the information that it is when it is required. We cannot feel that our operational memory is good or bad. We see that the patient does not respond to 70 or 80% of external stimulation. So something that doesn't reach our brain is not our problem. So that's why we have elderly people who go the wrong way on a highway and they are angry at everyone else that they are angry at them. So these are things that we need to see in various types of dementia. It will be different in frontal or frontal temporal dementia, where deficits start in those areas of the brain. And there are different types of cognitive impairment. An important process that we refer to is autobiographic memory. Neuropsychologists study that type of memory, but it is impossible to investigate because it is the memory of things that happened in our lives, and there are no two persons that would remember the same events in the same way, even if they both participated in it, because we perceive certain events from the point of view of its importance to ourselves. So if a house is on fire, it does matter whether it is my house, your house, or the house of a neighbor that we don't like. So then we have stimulation of amygdala, and this is the center of emotional reaction. The stronger that reaction, the stronger or the better we will remember the event, but it will be processed in a different way by different people. And in treatment of people with cognitive disorders, it is a very important function because we can use it to carry out memory therapy, which is one of the best new ideas in advanced stages of dementia. Cognitive reserve is very important. These are skills, knowledge, experience that are ingrained in our memory, often in an accidental way, but the higher the brain activity, the larger the reserve. The larger the cognitive reserve, the more protectively it works for possible brain damage. It has its pros and cons. Of course, it's better to rehabilitate a patient with large cognitive reserve, but such a patient, if they start suffering from Alzheimer's disease, especially in an early stage, we cannot detect it because for a very long time they have compensation mechanisms. They compensate for those deficits that they are aware of. So on the one hand, the cognitive reserve is something that helps us in rehabilitation, but on the other, we can expect for brain disorder to be detected much later than in the case of a person who has smaller cognitive reserve. But cognitive reserve and its level is affected by the level of education, but it's not always formal education. But formal education will not harm cognitive reserve, but social activity, number of social relationships is very important. The social network, these things are extremely important. Cognitive functions are also related to external factors, but also neurobiological factors. So we are talking about genetic polymorphism. I will not talk about that for too long, because genetic factors are only some of the factors affecting the cognitive reserve and problems or impairment appearing. But we know that even if we have genetic predispositions, we are not always doomed to develop a disease. Talking about cognitive functions in a modern way, we are not only talking about memory, attention, or spatial functions. We are talking about things that are important for our survival, communication, and our functioning. This is also very important in elderly people, because on the one hand, with age, we tend to lose some of the skills or abilities. We used to say that operational memory is the most efficient at 18 to 20 years of age, and then it only goes down. We do not fully agree with that, but these processes are visible much earlier than we would expect. But for communication, for us to be able to properly function, we need so-called cold cognition, like the memory, attention or operational memory, processing various types of information or language functions. They are always related to the so-called hot cognition. So that is the emotional aspect of cognitive function. We know that stress can weaken cognitive functions, especially chronic stress or very strong stress that exceeds the individual's adaptation capabilities. It can lead to structural changes in our central nervous system. So that is why all these cognitive aspects that together form social cognition, the mind theory related to perception of emotions, these are things that the rehabilitation specialists focus on, especially in elderly people. So We need to determine whether an individual understands intentions, prosodia, or whether they're able to modulate their expressions based on the context. So, in elderly people, we can say that cognitive functions may be weakened, and it can be very individual. Let me just warn you that some of us are very attached to the results of tests that we take at a certain moment in time. Today's results only indicate that those were the patient's results today, because it can differ in 1 month from now. In progressing diseases, they will get poorer, but in case of some diseases, we need to look at the reasons for cognitive impairment. So the patient may present certain impairment or certain disorders because they are poorly treated. For example, if they have polypragmasia, we need to adjust the dosage of medication to improve the treatment. Especially benzodiazepines are very dangerous here because in themselves they can lead to cognitive function impairment that resembles dementia. But for so-called healthy people, we have to think how to differentiate between healthy aging and excessive aging. And it is especially difficult at an early stage, because if we have well-developed dementia, we know that. But if a well-functioning patient starts presenting certain impairment in the beginning, then differential diagnosis is not that easy. From the psychological perspective, this late adulthood for many seniors is a very dynamic and developmental period in their lives. So we can treat it as yet another stage of development, provided that it's not bad aging related to cognitive dysfunction. But cognitive function impairment is also related or caused by emotional impairment. And there are very many factors here. We need to remember that resilience or resistance to stress among elderly people can be lower. Although it is often mentioned that elderly people experience or live through certain events due to their wisdom and experience. But they are very sensitive to social stereotypes, to convictions that, well, old age is something that did not work in God's creation, that there's no sense in life. We may say that all these stereotypes, we often mention ageism, but let's take a look at what's happening in the society. Young people do not understand that they can draw from older people, from their wisdom and experience. They say, it's my time, now I will do things my way, the new way. I will introduce new things because they will be better. Better, new, but new does not necessarily mean better. And the true wisdom is about being able to use what life brings, what new technologies offer, but we also need to use the experience and knowledge that is important to us.
Another thing related to that, and can deteriorate your cognitive functions, the issue of existential fear, anxiety, the issue of accepting your own age, an unsolved issue of passing or passing away. Many elderly people in palliative clinics or wards do not really feel that this is the end of life. They are not prepared for ending a certain stage of life. They are completely unprepared for this final stage of their life. As I said, the old person is a source of wisdom. What is more, this wisdom can be found in every person, even the person suffering from Alzheimer's. Not all the resources are lost at the moment. One of the speakers mentioned, tell me who you are as a human being, not what you have, or whether you have Alzheimer's or this and that, and you have this number of points on the scale. The other issue of depression, so important, I like to focus on the fact that it's very important at an early age to train something we could call emotional intelligence in people, young people, people who only have so-called cold cognition and solve tests in school. They ace the test, but they don't have the intellectual resources in the form of being able to talk with other people, empathy, and to empathize. They don't really deal with challenges so easily. In business, your hard intelligence doesn't matter that much. It's much more important to be emotionally intelligent, to feel people, sort of. Sometimes it's a knee-jerk reaction, or it generates knee-jerk reactions or automatic reactions. If you have the right level of emotional intelligence, it will be easier for you to go through stages of life. But what has a huge impact on cognitive deterioration is stress and depression. We're talking about the hippocampus atrophy. So the stress axis has been described very well. This pathway has been described very well. We know a lot about this. The stronger the stress, the stronger the depression period, the smaller cognitive control over the frontal cortex. And we can expect other disturbances accompanying depression at a later stage, especially pain. This was mentioned. Sensation of pain. We see very high correlation between depression and chronic pain disorders in the elderly. I don't know depression of older people without chronic pain at the same time. So there's a very strong correlation. Why? Because it's easier to deal with physical than mental pain. That's why in young people we have self-harm. Maybe we have various overarching domains like the emotional somatic domain, connected symptoms which are the same for pain symptoms and depression. Why is that so? Because you're the same regions in the brain. In fMRI, we would not really notice whether the patient is suffering mentally or physically. Considering the neurotransmitter sets involved in this process, we can see that what is responsible for anxiety, irritability, and pain, cognitive function, we have both genes or the serotonin transporter in depression and etiology of cognitive functions disturbances, and the adrenergic and noradrenergic systems are involved. We have 5-HT and 9E. We usually target treatment of pain and depression at the same time. Atrophy of hippocampus is the hippocampus, and this animal, which is an experimental model of pain, the animal in 4 weeks of increased stress, it loses half of the volume of the hippocampus. If you treat it well, in the next 4 or 6 weeks, it bounces back, so it rebuilds the volume. There's a huge hope for neuroplastic treatment. That's why we're talking about neurodegeneration and neuroprotection. I will not discuss it because we'll have a separate presentation. But how to understand disease. Disease, first, it's based on your genetic predisposal, and there's the interaction of external factors with our genome that bring about the disturbance of functions of neurons, and the structures and neural connections. What follows if the disease appears, it has various forms. It's social, psychosocial functioning, cognitive functioning, but also reactions to various therapeutical options. And these things are very much individual. That's why these reports were the basis for neurocognitive training. Another Nobel laureate, Eric Kandel, with Polish roots actually, said that every state of your brain is reflected in the state of your brain. It's functional, structural, but also by the impact of external factors who can talk about very deep impact on the expression of genes related to the disturbance or the disorder. Currently, we are implementing cognitive training based on neuroprotection. We're talking about global support of cognitive functions, pro-cognitive treatment, and the properly selected cognitive function training. And this training is based on neuroplasticity of the brain. It's very often used together with an enhancer or a facilitator. So customized functional training, on the other hand, we have this enhancer that can improve the functions, neuroprotection features. And such an enhancer can be your physical activity. We know that in rehabilitation, definitely we should remember about this principle that the training should be pleasant for the patient. They should feel their personal success. It shouldn't be like a lesson in school where you torture the patient with some tasks. This has to be pleasant for them and related with movement, with physical activity, performing some tasks and feeling the pleasure. And I wish you all this. However, if we're talking about healthy aging, I like to tell that the best definition was found in the Ode to the Old Age, poems by Stanisław Wasiak. It was attributed to Wisława Szymborska, our Nobel laureate. But the author was very happy about this, by the way. So that's the best way, that we have people who have a disease and suffer from disease, so they can reflect on their experience in different times. Even though sometimes you have more than a little pain in your back, enjoy every day and don't give a shit. Thank you. So that was a quote from the poem, obviously. It's last stanza. Thank you for this interesting message. The right diagnostics is so important. This is my take-home message. Customizing the reactions to the symptoms of cognitive functions. Everybody suffers from it differently. It's important to adjust the measures to the symptoms. Just a question to you. Do you have any questions to our speaker concerning the cognitive functions or disturbances or therapy? So, Professor, I'll give you some time to think about your questions. I don't see anybody yet, but the properly customized therapy and stimulation of the parting can reverse these disturbances or disorders? Is that possible? If I knew the answer, I would probably be a Nobel laureate at the moment. And I would enjoy that a lot, obviously. Obviously, there are patients who came to us and with dementia based on the neurologist's test, but as it turned out that it was just depression. It was a pseudo dementia, which was not treated for many years. And now I have a lady who is very active in self-help associations who came with such a diagnosis. So it is possible of reversing these symptoms provided that we know what we're dealing with. So the right diagnosis, developing a customized therapy plan, taking into account all those people involved in therapy. So for sure, there's no psychiatric diagnosis, let's say logical or neuropsychological diagnosis. We're talking about different domains of diagnosis and collaboration of all the specialists. I cannot really imagine providing therapy without including physiotherapy. We're doing that for people with cardiovascular operations, who have late symptoms, with patients with MCI, with POCD, and we think whether this is amnestic form, they have epsilon 4, polymorphism of genes, or do they have any other neurobiological markers that would make it more probable that we are right in our diagnosis. Thank you, Professor, so much for this excellent lecture.